these two images. One is by the Renaissance artist Botticelli, and the other is by the Baroque artist Artemisia Gentileschi. And they're depicting relatively similar subject matter. They're depicting scenes from the same story, the story of Judith beheading Holofernes. Before I explain the subject matter, let's look at these stylistically and talk about the difference between Renaissance art and Baroque art. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin Lecture Series. Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this is Art Trippin. So in general, when we're looking at Renaissance art, we're looking at a very idealized, beautiful style that's really interested in beauty. So Botticelli's Judith here is this, again, European beauty ideal of slender, pale, and blonde. And she is depicted in this very elegant pose, holding the olive branch, the symbol of peace, and a sword. And she's standing in contrapposto. We see an overall kind of light, almost pastel color palette with the blue sky behind her and this sweeping landscape off in the distance. So we see the artist using this kind of atmospheric perspective to create a sense of depth on the picture plane. The figure herself, Judith, and her maidservant, who you can see has somebody's head in a sack on top of her head, are depicted in a very elegant and rather restrained way. Now, when we look at the Baroque version, here is a scene from the same story of Judith beheading Holofernes. But in this instance, we have a different moment. We have the moment of action. Whereas in the Renaissance painting, we see after the action, we see the calm after the storm. In the Baroque version by Artemisia Gentileschi, we see Judith and her maidservant in the act of beheading this guy. They've got him on the bed. The maidservant is helping to hold him down, and Judith is sawing this guy's head off as blood squirts out. And if you zoom in and look really close, there's blood dripping down the bed. There's blood splatter on Judith's dress. And you see a very dramatic depiction of the same story. Instead of this vast background with a blue sky, we're in a darkened room, perhaps Holofernes' tent. And we see a very dramatic lighting, as if a spotlight is shining on the figures when they're on a stage, almost like theater lighting. Or we're in a dark room and there's a candle light that is casting these really dramatic shadows. We also see the figures standing in these dramatic poses. We see the arms of Judith at an angle. We see Holofernes reaching up and fighting back, and his body is at another diagonal. All of these diagonal lines in Gentileschi's version create a sense of drama and movement, whereas we see a lot of restraint and calm energy in this idealized Renaissance version. The Baroque version is dramatic, it's full of movement. It's a dramatic moment in the story itself. So here we see some of those stylistic differences between Renaissance and Baroque art. Now, what's the subject matter? Let's look at the story of Judith and Holofernes. This is a story from the book of Judith. Judith is a Jewish woman who is really devoted to God, and her town Bethulia was threatened by the Assyrian king, King Nebuchadnezzar, and his army under the command of General Holofernes. Now, Judith is both attractive and honorable, and she uses her beauty to sneak into the enemy camp. She pretends to defect, and she seduces the general Holofernes with a little bit of wine. Once she's got him sedated, a little tipsy, she beheads him. and she brings his head triumphantly back to Bethulia, showing her fellow Bethulians that there's no need to worry, the Assyrians are not going to attack, because she in fact has the head of the Assyrian general Holofernes. So in this story, Judith is this biblical hero. And this is really popular subject matter that we see depicted in the Renaissance. Here's Andrea Mantegna's Judith and Holofernes from 1495, and here's Sandro Botticelli's Return of Judith to Bethulia from 1470. Now we can see a really different style when we look at Artemisia Gentileschi's version of the same subject matter. And Artemisia Gentileschi's version of Judith beheading Holofernes really exemplifies the Baroque style. So what is the Baroque style? The Baroque style is known for exaggerated motion, strong diagonal lines that create a sense of movement, and very dramatic, extreme chiaroscuro that's often referred to as tenebrism. We also see really clear, easily interpreted subject matter. And this is due in part to some changes that the Catholic Church made in response to the Protestant Reformation. So we are talking about the period known as the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation is really a moment in history when the Catholic Church attempts to bring back followers to Catholicism, as Catholicism has lost a quarter of its followers to Protestantism. Let's have a little bit of context for the Baroque period. The Baroque period is when we see a lot of battles between the Catholic Church based in Rome and its reformers, primarily in Northern Europe. You may have heard of Martin Luther and his 95 Theses. This is when Luther and his followers leave the Catholic Church. And these Protestants use little to no art in their churches. So we will see that a lot of art in these Protestant countries in the Baroque period involves portraiture, landscape painting, and still life painting. And we'll tackle that in the next video. In this video, we're going to focus on what happens to art in those countries that stay Catholic. So primarily we're talking about Italy, but we could also talk about France and Spain. These are the Counter-Reformation countries, the countries that remain Catholic after the Protestant Revolution. Now, Catholics in the 1600s are also embarking on this new journey to colonizing what they call the New World and trying to bring back followers into the fold through this colonization. So they're going to be using art to bring people back, not only new converts, but also people who have lost their faith. And this is a key. This is what we're going to see with Baroque Counter-Reformation art, especially with artists like Caravaggio. Caravaggio is known for his emotional, dramatic depictions of subject matter that are meant to inspire in the viewer an emotional response, so that the viewer who may have felt that they have lost their faith can come back to the faith through the art that they get to look at. As we see new subject matter in the north, in the Protestant countries, where we will see new patrons, we will see still life paintings, group portraiture, landscape paintings, and genre paintings in the north. In the Catholic countries, in Counter-Reformation art, we will continue to see the traditional religious subject matter, and we will really start to see artists focusing on spiritual transformation. Themes of spiritual transformation and mysticism are wildly popular in Counter-Reformation art. So Baroque art is a sort of blanket term that's applied to all of the art from the 17th century. But truth be told, there are really many different styles of art that flourish in this time period. So what do we see in general when looking at Baroque architecture? And we can look at two examples. We can look at the facade of St. Peter's in Rome, and we can look at the facade of the Cathedral of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary in Mexico City. Here we see in both of these examples that we continue with the classical orders that are popular during the Renaissance, but we see more detail, more dynamic and energetic subject matter, and more adornment. The general idea of Baroque architecture is not a minimalistic style. The idea is more. More detail, more adornment, statues depicted at the roofline, more drama and more excess is the name of the game with Baroque architecture. Now, what about Baroque sculpture? Here we're looking at Bernini's Daphne and Apollo. Here we see strong diagonal lines, creating a sense of dynamism, movement, and drama. We will see that Baroque sculpture is often meant to be seen in the round so that you as a viewer move around it and see different images from different perspectives, as opposed to the very sort of straightforward frontal sculpture of the Renaissance, like we see here in Michelangelo's David. We can see in contrast a great deal of drama in Baroque sculpture. Here we're looking at Bernini's Saint Teresa of Avila. This sculpture is so good, I should probably make a video just on this sculpture. Let me know in the comments if you want to hear me talk about this sculpture in detail. But you can see this diagonal composition, this very dramatic fabric that's billowing, and this Saint Teresa, who has thrown her head back in ecstasy as she's being pierced with this arrow by this angel, and she's overwhelmed with the love of God. So we see a lot of drama and movement in Baroque sculpture, in contrast to the restraint of Renaissance sculpture. Now, when we look at Baroque painting, we see, again, strong asymmetrical compositions, diagonal lines creating this sense of movement, and this very strong lighting known as tenebrism. And we also see very dramatic interpretations of subject matter. So for example, when we're looking at Judith beheading Holofernes, we are inside the room with Judith as she's in the act of beheading a guy. This is not the quiet before the storm or the calm after the storm. We're right in the middle of the storm here. This is ideal subject matter in the Baroque Counter-Reformation art style. We'll see a dramatic naturalism, a sense of movement and drama with the diagonal lines and with this lighting effect, this tenebroso lighting effect of this dramatic chiaroscuro. And we will also see simple dark backgrounds. Sometimes the background is just painted black to avoid distraction and to focus the eye on the characters and the scene that is happening. We also see lots of warm, earthy tones in Baroque art, as opposed to perhaps a more cool color palette of the Renaissance. One of the innovations that we see with the artist Caravaggio, who we'll look at more in depth now, is that he used live models. Whereas Renaissance artists were looking back to classical sculpture, studying classical sculpture in order to make their paintings, we start to see artists like Caravaggio really painting from live models. And not just any live model, but he was actually taking people off the street, sometimes drunkards, people, hanging out at the pub, at the tavern, people, passed out in the streets, beggars. Anybody was considered worthy as a model for Caravaggio. And this use of regular, everyday people, even we might say working class or lower class individuals, depicted as holy figures, was really dramatic and revolutionary at the time. And in fact, some of the patrons did not quite understand what Caravaggio was doing. Arguably, Caravaggio's vision was that we could see the divine in anyone, that there is God not only in the king or the pope, but also in the drunkard on the street, that there is the divine, the potential for the divine within all of us. And this is a very reassuring idea at the time of the Baroque, at the time of the Counter-Reformation, when the Catholic Church is really attempting to bring people back into the fold after losing a quarter of the population of Europe to Protestantism. Now, let's talk about Caravaggio. Caravaggio, the artist himself, was a very interesting personality. Caravaggio was known to have a very fiery personality. There are some stories of him submitting a completed painting, a patron not understanding or perhaps not loving the painting immediately, and Caravaggio taking the painting, smashing it over his knee, throwing it at the patron, and storming out. So he was known to have a bit of a temper, a bit of a fiery personality, and as you might have heard, he is known for being involved in the death of at least one person. There's a lot of art history gossip around who, what, where, when, and why. Some art history gossip, which it's not true, but I'll tell you anyway. Some art history gossip states that Caravaggio was upset about the way that his artichokes were prepared. Caravaggio was known for hanging out at the tavern. This is sort of your modern day dive bar. And he would order food there as well as, sit around with his friends, maybe gambling, maybe talking about art and life. There are two main ways that artichokes are prepared in Rome at the time. And one way is steaming them and the other way is deep frying them. And supposedly, according to this art history gossip, Caravaggio was upset about the way his artichokes were prepared. Now, of course, we know this is not really reason for murder. So probably there may have been some dispute with somebody. Perhaps Caravaggio was intending to protect someone's honor. We don't know the details, but we do know that he was involved in what is essentially a bar fight or a brawl. Someone is killed and Caravaggio flees. He flees to Malta where he seeks protection from some of his patrons and eventually is able to work towards securing a pardon so that he can come back to Rome. On his trip back through southern Italy to Rome, he dies, and so he never makes it back to Rome. But despite his wild life, he's known for being a revolutionary in the world of art at this time in Baroque Italy. He brings a drama and a passion to painting that really hadn't been seen before. So let's look at one example. Let's look at the conversion of St. Paul from 1601. You can go see this painting today. It's in the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome. So you do have to travel to Rome to see this painting from 1601. Now, what's the iconography? So who is St. Paul? St. Paul has another name. He is known as Saul, and Saul is a Roman who is on his way to Damascus to go persecute Christians, that great Roman pastime of persecuting Christians. Now, when Saul is on his journey, on his road to Damascus, he's blinded by a bright flash of light that causes him to fall off his horse. So he's knocked off his horse and he's blinded by this light and he asks, "Who is it?" And Jesus replies, "It is I, Jesus. Why do you persecute me?" And Saul, in this moment, has this mystical moment of transformation, and he's overwhelmed by the love of Christ, and he basically converts to Christianity in this moment. He quits persecuting Christians. He changes his name to Paul and goes on to become, one of the great leaders of the Catholic Church. In this painting, Caravaggio is representing that moment of conversion when Paul has been knocked off his horse. This painting is positioned up at a little bit of a height in the church. So when you're in the church, you would sort of kneel down below this and you would be at about eye level with St. Paul. So you too would be looking up at this horse and this light that's coming from the heavens. So you, as the viewer, are almost in the position of Paul, that you maybe have not been a good Christian. You may have been against all of this, but you, like Paul, can have this transformative experience where you see the light and return to Christ. Here you see Saul, or St. Paul, has his arms lifted up, outstretched at a diagonal. That diagonal creates a sense of movement. Your eye goes up and follows the horse who has lifted his front hoof. And we see this dramatic lighting, this kind of black background and really strong, really harsh candlelit feel that helps to portray this blinding light that Paul has seen on his road to Damascus. This really dramatic lighting effect, this is what we call tenebrism. This is very extreme chiaroscuro, almost unrealistic. It creates this spotlight effect that is typical of Baroque art. And we can see in this painting really convincing reality effects, extreme naturalism, a really crisp, clean way of painting, and scrupulous detail, and interest in texture and the play of light. So we can see the influence of some of that Northern Renaissance art in the work of Caravaggio. You will also see that in a lot of Baroque art, we're brought really close into the scene. We have a very tight and simplified composition. There are no extras. There's no background. You don't even see the road to Damascus. If this were in a Renaissance painting, we might see a whole landscape and the road and Damascus off in the distance. But here we're just getting an image that's reduced to its essential elements. Just these two figures, the horse and the attendant, and Saul who's been knocked off the horse. And the figures are placed against this flat black background that helps to focus our eyes on the scene, to show this kind of religious exercise, the emotional impact of being overwhelmed by this light that symbolizes the love of Christ. We can also see that Caravaggio brought in sort of an old peasant man as the model, and this really shocked many of his contemporaries. But this was very important for Caravaggio to express this kind of naturalism, to make art relatable to the masses, so that you and I, when we go into the church to see this, that we might feel that maybe we have been lost, we have been on our own road to Damascus, and we can at any moment be overwhelmed and transformed by the love of Christ. We can see a similar theme in Caravaggio's Christ with Doubting Thomas from 1602. Do you know this iconography? This is a story from the resurrection. So after Christ has died, he comes back to life, and there's sort of word around town that Jesus is back. And one of his followers, Thomas, says, yeah, that's like not a real thing. You don't like come back to life after you die. Like, I don't believe it. And Thomas says, I will believe it when I stick my dirty little finger inside Jesus's wound, because he has this wound on his side where when he's on the cross, he's being tortured by this Roman soldier Longinus who stabs him, and he has this wound on his right side. So here we see Caravaggio's Christ with Doubting Thomas, where Jesus is back and he has met up with Thomas, and he has actually grabbed Thomas's hand and taken that finger and stuck it in his wound. Now, I do not recommend sticking your fingers in wounds, especially if they're dirty 17th century fingers, It was before the time of antibiotics. Now, here we see Thomas depicted as a humble individual. In fact, these followers who are the followers of Christ are depicted in torn, tattered clothes. Look at Thomas's shirt, has a tear on it. Their fingers, their fingernails are dirty. They've got wrinkly foreheads. They've got the red noses of tavern dwellers. These are not idealized angelic figures. These are the kind of people you might see in the tavern in the 1600s. These are regular everyday people taken off the streets, brought into Caravaggio's studio, posed, painted and sketched from real life, and these regular people, these drunkards, these guys off the street become the holy figures. So again, the idea is that maybe you doubted like Thomas. Maybe you declared that you would need to stick your finger in that wound if you were to really believe. But the idea here is that Jesus will always be waiting there for you, waiting for you to come back into the fold. This is the message of Italian Counter-Reformation art. This is art in service of the church, art in service of bringing people back in to the fold. Now, when we look at this painting by Caravaggio, we can see a very warm, earthy, kind of muddy color palette, this flat black background, this very tight composition. In fact, the figures are all crouching over, and we are sort of crouching in to catch this scene. We don't see a big dramatic landscape in the background. We don't see a vast expanse of space. We see a very tight composition. There's no sense of perspective. There are no classical references. There's no real interest in sort of classical architecture or sculpture. There's not that much interest in the human form per se, but instead Caravaggio is representing a mystical moment in a very real way. He's depicting regular everyday people, peasants, working class people, as holy figures. And we've got this very dramatic lighting that draws us in and creates a sense of intimacy in this dramatic scene. This mystical moment that we too could have this mystical transformation. So what has Caravaggio brought to the field of Western art history? In this Baroque era, in Italian Counter-Reformation art, we see Caravaggio bringing a new concept of the relationship between the observer and the artwork, that the artist is creating a direct and real communication with the viewer, and that the viewer can access the divine through the imagery. We're going to see that art is really made to seem believable and relatable to the common people, regular everyday people. The use of peasants as models and the details like dirty feet or dirty fingernails are going to be privileged to create this sense of reality that is previously unseen. In Renaissance art in Italy, we see a great deal of idealizing, almost like the image has a filter. But here in the Baroque, we're going to see the reality. No more idealizing, but extreme realism. And Caravaggio brings this style and it spreads throughout Europe. And in fact, there's even a school of thought that follows him. And these artists are called I Caravaggisti. These are the artists painting in the style of Caravaggio. And I will talk about one in my next video. That is the artist Artemisia Gentileschi. So stay tuned for the next video on the female artist of the Baroque, Artemisia Gentileschi. And then in the video after that, we will talk about the Baroque period in Northern Europe. Hopefully this video has given you a great introduction to the Italian Baroque and to Counter-Reformation art. Stay tuned for more Art Trippin'.